Hi, the title of our presentation is The Anatomy of Economic Collapse. Our objective is to explore the consequences of a rigid adherence to theoretical dogma, to use the historical lens of the Soviet Union and Maoist China to examine the structural pathology of Marxist centrally planned economies. We are asking a fundamental question. Was the collapse of these systems merely a result of bad leadership and political corruption? Or was it the inevitable outcome of a flawed economic design, of an overly dogmatic adherence to theory? Our thesis is that central planning suffers from inherent theoretical defects that make rational economic activity impossible. As we dissect this anatomy of collapse, we will rely heavily on the insights of the Austrian School of Economics, particularly Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. Mises argued as early as 1920 that socialism is not just inefficient, but impossible as a rational economic system. Why? Because the abolition of private property eliminates the market for capital goods, factories, machinery, and raw materials. Without a market, there are no genuine money prices. And without prices to serve as a common denominator, central planners cannot calculate the relative scarcity or efficiency of any production method. Mises described this state as groping in the dark, where planners produce an absurd apparatus of goods that do not align with actual human needs. Throughout this presentation, we will explore three structural impediments that constitute the framework of this failure mechanism. The first is the calculation problem. As mentioned, without market-generated price signals, there is no way to determine the opportunity cost of resources. Planners cannot know whether using steel for a railway is more value-creating than using it for housing, because they lack the price data to compare these heterogeneous projects. The second is the knowledge problem. Friedrich Hayek expanded this critique by identifying that the information required to run an economy, knowledge of local conditions, temporary shortages, and specific technologies, is dispersed among millions of individuals. This tacit knowledge cannot be centralized or entered into a computer model. In a market, prices communicate this information instantly. Central planning severs this telecommunication system. And the third issue is the incentive problem. Finally, we'll address the suppression of the entrepreneurial spirit. In a system where the state owns the means of production, the alertness required to spot new opportunities and correct inefficiencies is unrewarded. The state effectively criminalizes the very entrepreneurship required to solve economic problems. This leads to stagnation and a quiet life for managers who have no stake in the outcome. By the end of this session, it will be clear why the architecture of failure was baked into the system from the very start. We do this so that we might better understand the point we made in week 10, that theory is a lens through which to view aspects of a problem in search of a solution, not a dogmatic prescription for action. If we are to understand the mechanisms of this failure, we must first understand the blueprint. The planned economies of the 20th century were not built on random authoritarian principles, but on a specific economic doctrine, the labor theory of value. Here we outline the core Marxist premise that the value of a commodity is objectively determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce it. Marx argued that, unlike the chaotic fluctuations of market prices, there is an underlying substance of value, congealed human labor, which serves as the true regulator of the economy. This is not merely a moral claim, it is presented as a scientific law. Crucially, it is this theory that leads to the concept of surplus value. Marx argued that workers produce more value during their shift than they receive in wages, which cover only their subsistence. The difference, surplus value, is appropriated by the capitalist as profit. From this perspective, profit is not a reward for risk, deferred consumption, or wise resource allocation, as traditional economists would argue. Instead, profit is mathematically defined as unpaid labor. Consequently, the market mechanism is viewed not as a tool for coordination, but as a system of concealment that hides this exploitation behind a veil of commodity exchange. However, this brings us to the first structural fracture in the failure mechanism, the transformation problem. Marx ran into a mathematical inconsistency when trying to link his concept of value, labour time, to actual market prices. In a competitive market, capital moves between industries to equalize profit rates. However, because different industries use different ratios of machinery to labor, strict adherence to the labor theory of value would result in different profit rates, which contradicts observable reality. Marx attempted to solve this by transforming values into prices of production, but critics, and indeed many modern mathematical economists, have pointed out that you cannot simultaneously satisfy the calculation of value and the calculation of price without breaking a system's internal logic. This is not just an academic quibble, it implies that the central planner's yardstick, labour time, cannot accurately reflect the reflective scarcity or utility of capital goods. Notice what is missing from this premise: subjectivity. By focusing entirely on the cost of production, the labour inputs, the Marxist premise ignores the utility of the product to the consumer. As we shall see in later slides, this rejection of subjective value is catastrophic. It leads planners to focus on gross output targets, producing things, rather than value creation, satisfying wants. In summary, the Marxist premise assumes that the economy is a machine to be engineered based on objective inputs, rather than a complex organism driven by subjective human preferences. This error in the blueprints made the collapse inevitable. We now move to explore the structural crack. If the economic calculation problem is the foundation of the failure of Marxist theory, this concept, the knowledge problem, is the fracture that runs through the entire edifice of central planning. While Mises focused on the calculation of capital, his student Friedrich Hayek expanded the critique to address the nature of information itself. The fundamental question that Hayek posed was, what is the problem we wish to solve when we try to construct a rational economic order? The fatal error of central planning, from this perspective, is the assumption that the data required to run an economy is given to a single mind in its totality. In reality, the knowledge necessary for economic coordination never exists in a concentrated or integrated form, but rather as dispersed pieces of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge held by separate individuals. To understand this crack, we must establish a distinction between two types of knowledge. The first is explicit knowledge, information that can be documented, easily communicated, and shared. Planners assume economics is merely an engineering problem, a matter of solving equations using technical data. The second is tacit knowledge. Hayek argued that there is a vast body of unorganized knowledge regarding the particular circumstances of time and place. This is the knowledge of the man on the spot, the factory manager who knows a machine's idiosyncrasies, the shipper who knows of a temporary gap in cargo space, or the trader who spots a local surplus. This knowledge is tacit. It is often unconscious and cannot be conveyed statistically to a central planning board without losing its essence or arriving too late to be useful. By centralizing decision-making, the state effectively throws away this dispersed knowledge, utilizing only a fraction of the information available to society. So, if knowledge is dispersed, how does a market economy bridge this gap? Hayek described the price system not merely as a tool of exchange, but as a mechanism for communicating information. Consider the classic example of tin. If the price of tin rises, a manufacturer does not need to know why, whether a mine has collapsed in South America or demand has surged in electronics. The price signal alone conveys all the necessary information that tin has become scarcer. The manufacturer immediately economizes on tin, perhaps switching to a substitute without any order from a government bureau. Hayek called this the marvel of the market. It acts as a system of telecommunications that allows individual producers to adjust their activities to changes of which they may know nothing more than the price movement. It functions as a division of knowledge parallel to the division of labor. Modern proponents of planning often argue that supercomputers and big data can fix this crack. They claim that with enough processing power, the state can solve the millions of simultaneous equations required to balance supply and demand. However, our analysis suggests that this is a category error. The problem is not computational, that is, processing data. It is epistemological, generating data. Computers can only process information that has been explicitly entered into them. They cannot simulate the discovery process of the entrepreneur who acts on a hunch or spots a new opportunity that does not yet exist in the data. As Mises noted, the planners cannot calculate because they are groping in the dark regarding the future valuation of resources. A static computer model cannot capture the dynamic, ever-changing structure of human preferences and production methods. Therefore, the structural crack is this. Central planning requires the centralization of knowledge that is, by its very nature, incapable of being centralized. By destroying the price system, planned economies destroy the only mechanism capable of coordinating the dispersed knowledge of millions of individuals, inevitably leading to the irrational use of resources. We can better understand this by exploring a paradox. For much of the 19th century, classical economists, including Karl Marx, struggled with the conundrum known as the paradox of value, or the diamond-water paradox. The paradox is this: why is water, which is essential for life, so cheap, while diamonds, which are mere fripperies, are so expensive? The resolution of this paradox was a pivotal moment in economic history, the marginalist revolution of the 1870s. To understand why planned economies fail, we must understand the fundamental error in their valuation mechanism. Because they could not resolve this based on utility, classical economists concluded that value must be determined by something objective, specifically the cost of production or the quantity of labor put into the good. And it was this error that became the foundation of the Marxist labor theory of value. The marginalist revolution, led by Karl Menger, William Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras, solved this paradox by introducing the concept of marginal utility. They realized that we do not value goods in the abstract, for example, water versus diamonds as a class. We value specific units of a good at the margin of their use. As you acquire more units of a good, the satisfaction, the utility you derive from each additional unit decreases. Water is abundant, therefore the marginal utility of the last bucket is very low. We use it to wash our cars or other uses. Diamonds are scarce, therefore the marginal utility of a single stone is extremely high. As Jevons famously declared, value depends entirely upon utility. It is not the labour of the past that gives a good value, but its utility for the future satisfaction of wants. This brings us to the critical distinction between subjective and objective value. Marxist and socialist theory relies on the idea that value is objective or intrinsic, something congealed in the product by the labour hours expended. They assume that if a factory expends 10 hours producing a chandelier, that chandelier possesses an objective value equivalent to 10 hours of labour. The marginalists proved this is false. Value is strictly subjective. It exists only in the mind of the valuer. A product has no value if no one desires it, regardless of how many labour hours were spent producing it. As the Austrian economist Karl Menger argued, value is not a property inherent in goods, but a relationship between goods and the satisfaction of human needs. Consequently, costs do not determine prices. Rather, anticipated market prices derived from consumer utility determine what producers are willing to pay for costs, labour and resources. This reversed the causal arrow of classical economics. Why is this fatal for central planning? Because value is subjective and based on marginal decisions made by millions of individuals in specific moments. It cannot be measured or aggregated by a central authority. A central planner can count bricks and labour hours, objective data, but they cannot measure the shifting subjective satisfaction consumers derive from different goods. Without market prices to transmit these subjective marginal valuations, planners are forced to rely on crude objective targets, for example, gross output weights. This leads to production of goods that are technically costly in labour terms, but economically worthless to society. By rejecting the marginalist revolution, planned economies lock themselves into an obsolete 19th century theory that severed the link between production and human satisfaction. Having established that value is subjective, that is, it only exists within the mind of the individual, this creates a dilemma. If value is a private internal ranking of preferences, how does it coordinate a complex economy involving millions of strangers? The answer lies in the price mechanism. In a market economy, money prices serve as the external manifestation of these internal subjective valuations. Value is a signal. This explains how the market transformed dispersed personal desires into objective data that guides production. Friedrich Hayek famously described the price system not as a tool for measuring value, but as a mechanism for communicating information. He used the metaphor of a system of telecommunications. This brings us to a critical distinction often missed by central planners, the difference between technical efficiency and economic efficiency. As Ludwig von Mises pointed out, technology can tell us how to build a bridge. It can calculate the stress loads for steel, iron, or even platinum, but technology cannot tell us which material is the best use of society's scarce resources. An engineer might argue that a platinum bridge is technically superior because it is more durable, but the market price signals that platinum is far too valuable in other uses, such as catalytic converters or jewelry, to be wasted on a bridge. Without the signal of market prices, a socialist planner is, as Mises described, groping in the dark. They can achieve technical feats, launching satellites or building dams, but they have no way of calculating whether they are destroying more value than they are creating. Who receives these signals? The entrepreneur. In the failure mechanism of planned economies, this role is eliminated, but in a market, the entrepreneur relies on price signals to calculate profit and loss. Profit is the signal that resources are being used efficiently to satisfy customer preferences. Loss is the ruthless signal that resources are being wasted. Mises noted that the capitalist does not just invest, he interprets these signals to align production with the most urgent wants of consumers. By abolishing the market for capital goods, socialism effectively smashes the thermometer and then claims to have cured the fever. Therefore, when the state interferes with prices through controls, subsidies, or inflation, it is not merely adjusting numbers, it is jamming the telecommunications network of the economy. It creates noise that leads to malinvestment and chaos. If the price system is the nervous system of the economy, as we previously established, then central planning performs a lobotomy. Severing the signal illustrates exactly how the abolition of private property destroys the mechanism of economic calculation. The fundamental critique provided by Ludwig von Mises in 1920 was not that the socialist planners lacked good intentions or even computational power. It was that by nationalizing the means of production, they eliminated the market for capital goods. Without a market where factories, machines, and raw materials are bought and sold, there can be no genuine money prices for these items. Without prices, the signal is severed. It is vital to distinguish between technical knowledge and economic calculation. The Central Planning Board can amass vast quantities of technical data. Reports on the tensile strength of steel or the geology of coal deposits may accumulate in huge piles on the director's desk. Engineers can tell us how to build a bridge or a tunnel. However, without the price signal, the planner cannot answer the fundamental economic question: should we build the bridge? And if so, should we use steel, iron, or platinum? Technically, a platinum bridge might be more durable than an iron one, but in a market economy, the high price of platinum signals that it is urgently needed elsewhere, perhaps for medical equipment or catalytic converters. The planner, bereft of these price signals, cannot calculate the opportunity cost of using resources. They are, as Mises famously put it, groping in the dark. When the sensitive mechanism that emits these storm signals is switched off, the planner loses the ability to detect disequilibrium. Mises argued that instead of the anarchical production of the market, which is actually guided by consumer preference, socialism results in the senseless order of an irrational machine. The wheels turn, coal is mined, and the factories hum, but they run, as he puts it, to no effect. Because the production structure is severed from consumer demand, the economy produces arbitrary arrays of goods. We see the phenomenon described by George Reisman, an economy that floods the people with shirts while making them go barefoot, or inundates them with shoes while making them go shirtless. The planner cannot align the production of intermediate goods like zips and laces with final goods, trousers and shoes, resulting in finished products that are unusable. Some theorists, such as Oscar Lange, argued that planners could simulate this signal by setting accounting prices and adjusting them through trial and error, a concept known as market socialism. However, as Hayek and Mises countered, this ignores the dynamic nature of the market. Real prices are not static variables in an equation. They are the result of purposeful competition where entrepreneurs risk their own capital on future uncertainties. A bureaucrat adjusting prices based on yesterday's inventory reports is merely looking at a history book, whereas an entrepreneur looks at the future. By the time the central board calculates the new price of tin or electricity, the conditions of time and place have already changed. Ultimately, by severing the signal of market prices, the planned economy renders itself structurally incapable of rational economic activity. It replaces the wisdom of the distinct individual with the arbitrary decrees of a bureaucracy that legally and practically cannot know the value of what it consumes or produces. Critics of socialism often focus on its practical failures, shortages, queues, and low quality. However, the failure mechanism begins much earlier, in the theoretical blueprint itself. The system is not merely difficult to implement, it is internally incoherent. It attempts to derive economic order from premises that logically contradict the requirements of a complex society. The first breakdown occurs within the Marxist theory of value itself, known to economists as the transformation problem. Marx argued that the value of a commodity is determined by the labour time socially necessary to produce it. He also acknowledged that in a market, capital moves between industries to equalize the rate of profit. Here lies the incoherence. Industries have different ratios of machinery to labour, what Marx called the organic composition of capital. If value comes only from labour, industries with more labour should produce more surplus value and thus higher profit rates. But in reality, competition equalizes profits regardless of the labour ratio. Marx attempted to solve this by transforming labour values into prices of production, but he could not do so without breaking his own system's internal logic regarding the source of value. As later economists demonstrated, you cannot simultaneously hold that labour is the sole source of value and that profit rates equalize across capital-intensive industries without the mathematics falling apart. The blueprint of the planned economy is mathematically flawed at its foundation. Moving from theory to practice, we face the issue of capital structure. As the economist Ludwig Lachmann argued, capital is not a homogeneous blob. It is a complex structure of heterogeneous goods, machines, buildings, and tools that must fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. In a market, the price system acts as the coordinator that brings the disparate plans of millions of producers and consumers into consistency. Equilibrium is simply a state where these plans mesh successfully. Without price signals to reveal which capital combinations create value, the socialist economy suffers from inconsistent capital change. The planner might order the construction of a steel mill, Plan A, and a railway, Plan B, not realizing that the specific resource required for both are incompatible, or that the output of one does not fit the needs of the other. This leads to structural maladjustment, a chaotic jumble of capital goods that cannot be integrated into a functioning whole. The parts exist, but they do not form a coherent structure. A common defense of centrally planned economies is that the state can direct vast resources towards scientific advancement. Think of the Soviet space program, for example. However, while the state can command technical feats, it suffers from a structural inability to foster sustainable economic innovation. In this slide, we examine why the planned economy is inherently conservative and static. Unlike the market, which is a perennial gale of creative destruction, the planned economy is biased towards the status quo. The mechanism of failure here is not just a lack of funding, but a fundamental disconnection between invention and value. First, we must look at the incentives of the socialist manager compared to the capitalist entrepreneur. In a system of state ownership, managers are merely caretakers of public assets, not owners. Because they do not own the capital, they cannot capitalize on the rewards of risk-taking, nor do they personally suffer the loss of failure. Consequently, managers in state-owned enterprises lack the incentive to exert effort or take risks. They prefer what economists call the quiet life, avoiding the uncertainty of new projects. Research has shown that while state-owned enterprises may have easier access to funding, the lack of performance-based incentives leads to under-exertion and excessive risk aversion. Furthermore, every decision must be approved by a central authority. This results in bureaucratic delays that make it impossible to respond quickly to changing technological conditions. By the time a central board approves a new method, it may already be obsolete. Second, innovation in a planned economy is subordinate to political rather than economic goals. In systems where politicians control enterprises, resources are often diverted away from long-term research and development towards short-term visible goals like employment maximization. Empirical studies on state-owned firms show a significant drop in innovation investment in the years preceding national elections. The state acts as a myopic owner because politicians are driven by re-election or regime stability. They often sacrifice the long-term capital investments required for innovation to satisfy immediate political constituencies. This creates a system where industries are frozen in time, continuing to produce obsolete goods to protect jobs rather than evolving to meet new needs. Third, we observe a critical distinction between the inputs of innovation and the outputs. It is a myth that planned economies simply do not invest in science. In fact, state-owned firms often invest more in research and development than private firms because they have soft budget constraints and access to state banks. However, this investment is grossly inefficient. Data suggests that state-owned enterprises produce significantly fewer patents per dollar invested than private firms. Moreover, the patents they do produce tend to have lower commercial value. In the Eastern Bloc, research was often conducted in separate institutes isolated from the factory floor, without price signals to indicate which technologies are economically viable. The state produces basic science or technologies with social spillover, but fails to translate this into goods that actually serve the consumer. Ultimately, innovation is a discovery process guided by price signals. High prices signal a need for new methods. For instance, a rise in oil prices incentivizes solar patents. By abolishing price signals and competition, the planned economy destroys the mechanism that tells us what to innovate. We are left with a system that can build a rocket but cannot design a decent pair of shoes. We have spent the previous slides dissecting the theoretical anatomy of the failure mechanism. We have discussed the calculation problem, the knowledge problem, and the perversity of incentives. Now, with our case study, we move from the abstract to the concrete. While we could look at the stagnation of East Germany or the collapse of the Soviet Union, the most devastating example of these theoretical errors manifesting in reality is the Great Leap Forward in China between 1958 and 1962. This was an attempt to defy economic law through sheer political willpower, and it resulted in the largest famine in human history. The Great Leap Forward was predicated on the rejection of technical and economic constraints. Mao Zedong believed that revolutionary enthusiasm and mass mobilization could substitute for capital investment and rational economic calculation. The objective was to catch up with the United Kingdom in industrial output within 15 years. Instead of relying on market signals to allocate labour efficiently, the state forcibly collectivised agriculture and diverted millions of peasants into industrial projects. This illustrates the blind giant we discussed earlier. The state had the power to move millions of people, but lacked the sight to know where they should go. The most infamous example of Mises's planned chaos was the campaign to boost steel production. Without a market to determine the most efficient methods of steel production, the planners encouraged the creation of backyard furnaces in every commune. Peasants were forced to melt down useful capital goods, pots, pans and agricultural tools, to meet steel quotas. The output was often useless, low-quality pig iron that cracked when used. Economically, this was negative value added. Valuable finished goods, tools, were destroyed to produce useless raw material, scrap metal, shrinking the nation's wealth while technically increasing production statistics. We previously discussed how central planning severs the nervous system of the economy. In the Great Leap Forward, this information failure turned deadly. Local officials, terrified of failing to meet the impossible quotas set by the central planners, began reporting massively inflated harvest figures. In some cases, production figures were inflated by up to 10 times the actual amount. The central government, believing these falsehoods, calculated their grain requisitions based on the fantasy numbers. They took the food necessary for the peasants' survival, believing it was merely a surplus, leaving the countryside to starve while granaries held grain for export. This is the ultimate tragedy of the calculation problem. The system could not distinguish between a bumper crop and a famine until it was too late. The failure of central knowledge also extended to ecology. In the Four Pests campaign, the state ordered the extermination of sparrows, believing they ate too much grain. Without market mechanisms or independent experts to correct the error, the campaign succeeded in killing the sparrows. However, sparrows also eat locusts. The result was a plague of locusts that devoured the crops, exacerbating the famine. This perfectly illustrates Hayek's critique. A single mind cannot comprehend the complex interdependencies of a biological or economic system. Finally, to prove that this was a systemic failure of socialism rather than merely a Chinese failure, we can look briefly at the Soviet Union. In the USSR, centrally managed farms were notoriously inefficient. However, the state permitted tiny private garden plots, about 3% of the land. These private plots, operating on quasi-market principles, accounted for over 25% of the total agricultural output. When individuals were allowed to reap the rewards of their labour and utilise their specific knowledge of time and place, productivity soared. When they were forced into the rigid plan, productivity collapsed. The Great Leap Forward resulted in an estimated death toll of between 15 and 55 million people. It serves as a grim historical testament to our thesis. When you destroy the price mechanism, destroy private property, and suppress the truth-telling function of the market, the result is not a rational order, but a chaotic descent into barbarism. If the Great Leap Forward was the acute, catastrophic phase of the failure mechanism, the phenomenon we discuss here represents the chronic, debilitating condition of everyday life under central planning. In a market economy, a shortage is a temporary signal that demand exceeds supply, which triggers a price rise and subsequent increased production. In a planned economy, however, shortages are not bugs, they are features. They are the inevitable mathematical result of fixing prices below the market clearing level. As we see in the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc nations, the queue became a quintessentially socialist institution, a symbol of the state's inability to coordinate production with human needs. Why do these shortages persist? The answer lies in the destruction of the price mechanism. In a free market, if a good becomes scarce, its price rises. This forces consumers to economize and incentivizes producers to increase supply. When the state fixes prices to ensure affordability, it blinds the economy to reality. At artificially low prices, demand inevitably exceeds supply. Since prices are not allowed to clear the market, the goods disappear from the shelves. As Mises argued, the result is not the poor get milk at a lower price, but that the marginal producers stop producing milk entirely, leaving less for everyone. When money prices fail to ration goods, they are rationed by time. The cost of a loaf of bread was not just a few kopecks, but the 4 hours spent standing in the cold to buy it. This queue standing was a form of political and economic restraint, keeping the population in a state of dependency. The shortages were not merely a lack of quantity, they were a failure of coordination. Without the profit and loss test to tell them what consumers actually wanted, planners produced arbitrary arrays of goods. We've already seen the phenomenon described by George Reisman as an economy that floods the people with shirts while making them go barefoot, or inundates them with shoes while making them go shirtless. This chaos extended to the smallest details. As noted by critics of the Soviet system, planners might set targets for trousers but fail to coordinate the supply of zips. The result was factories turning out thousands of pairs of trousers without zips, useless to the consumer but fulfilling the gross output target of the plan. The planner can command the gross output, but they cannot command the intricate synchronization required to make that output useful. Finally, how do factories operate in this environment? Because the supply chain was notoriously unreliable, factory managers engaged in massive defensive hoarding. They stockpiled labour, raw materials, and spare parts far beyond their immediate needs, exacerbating shortages elsewhere in the economy. To survive, the system relied on the black market. Managers employed pushers or fixers, informal brokers who used bribery and personal connections to secure essential materials that the central plan failed to deliver. The only reason the planned economy functioned at all was because of these illegal market mechanisms operating in the shadows. Ultimately, systemic shortages demonstrate that you cannot abolish the law of economics by decree. By removing the price signal, the planned economy does not create abundance, it creates a world where everything is technically cheap, but nothing is actually available. We have explored the inability to calculate, the blocking of information, and the distortion of incentives. Now we witness the cumulative effect of these failures. Necrosis is the medical term for the death of the body tissue due to a lack of blood flow. In the economic body, when the blood, the price signal, is cut off, the tissue does not merely stop growing, it begins to die. This slide argues that the collapse of planned economies was not a result of external shocks, but of an internal degenerative process of capital consumption and social disintegration. The first symptom of this necrosis is the phenomenon Ludwig von Mises identified as capital consumption, or destructionism. For a time, a planned economy may appear robust. Factories are running and outputs are recorded. However, Mises warned that this is often an illusion created by consuming the capital accumulated during the previous capitalist era. The planners can seize wealth and redistribute it, creating a temporary sensation of prosperity, but they lack the mechanism to maintain and replace that capital efficiently. It is the economic equivalent of a spendthrift heir who lives luxuriously by selling off the family estate. As Mises noted, they sacrifice the future to the present. The walls of the factory stand, but the machinery inside becomes obsolete, cannibalized for spare parts, and eventually useless. By the time the damage is visible, the capital base of society has been hollowed out. Second, we see the rigidity of the plan facing the fluidity of reality. Socialist theory often implicitly assumes a stationary state, a world where tomorrow is exactly like today. If the world never changed, perhaps a central plan could work once established, but as Hayek and Mises emphasized, the real world is one of constant, unexpected change. When consumer tastes change or a resource becomes scarce, the market adapts instantly through price shifts. The planned economy, however, is locked into a rigid bureaucratic schedule. It cannot pivot. This leads to what Mises called the senseless order of an irrational machine. The wheels turn, but they no longer mesh with the needs of the people. The economy becomes a fossil, unable to evolve, leading to the regression of the division of labour. Crucially, we must acknowledge that the Soviet Union and its satellites never existed in a total vacuum. They survived as long as they did, largely because they were parasitic on the capitalistic world market. As acknowledged by British economist Peter Wiles and even admitted by Soviet planners, these regimes used world market prices to guide their internal trade. Without the Wall Street Journal or the London Financial Times to tell them what wheat or steel was worth, they would have been helpless. When asked what they would do if the whole world became socialist, a Polish planner famously replied, "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it." The reality is they could not cross that bridge. Without an external market to generate prices, the inevitable necrosis would have been immediate and total. Finally, as the economic tissue dies, the state must use increasing force to keep the organism moving. As the failure of the plan becomes evident, the state does not retreat. It intervenes further. As Mises explained, if the government fixes the price of milk, it must eventually fix the price of fodder, then the wages of farmhand, until it controls every sector. This necessitates the suppression of dissent. You cannot have a democratic central plan because the plan requires the unitary direction of all resources. Any opposition to the plan is treated as sabotage. Thus, the economic failure leads inevitably to political tyranny, not as an accident, but as a requirement for the system's survival. Ultimately, the inevitable necrosis is the return to a primitive state. By destroying the division of labour and the price mechanism, the planned economy dismantles civilization itself, leaving behind a rusting, irrational industrial landscape that can no longer sustain human life. A common historical apology for the atrocities of the 20th century socialist regimes is that they were accidents of history, that the noble economic goals of planning were hijacked by cruel men like Stalin or Mao. This slide argues the precise opposite. Tyranny is not a bug or an unfortunate side effect of central planning. It is a necessary feature. As Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek demonstrated, you cannot separate economic control from political control. When the state attempts to substitute a single comprehensive plan for the individual plans of millions of consumers, it must necessarily suppress dissent to ensure the plan's execution. The planner is a potential dictator who wishes to deprive all other people of the power to plan their own lives. First, consider the position of the individual when the state is the only employer. In a market economy, if you disagree with your boss or are blacklisted by one industry, you can seek employment elsewhere. Under central planning, the state owns every factory, office, and printing press. Even Leon Trotsky, a founding father of the Soviet system, eventually recognized this terrifying reality in his exile. He famously admitted, "In a country where the sole employer is the state, opposition means death by slow starvation." The old principle, "who does not work shall not eat," has been replaced by a new one, "who does not obey shall not eat." Freedom of the press and assembly becomes illusory when the government owns all the paper mills, printing offices, and assembly halls. The state determines who speaks and who eats. Second, democratic choice is structurally incompatible with a rigid economic plan. If a central board determines that resources must be used to build a dam or a steel mill, public dissent cannot be tolerated, as it would disrupt the allocation of resources. As noted by the socialist theoreticians Sidney and Beatrice Webb, whilst the work is in progress, any expression of doubt is an act of disloyalty or even of treachery. Even British socialist Harold Laski argued that the transition to socialism would require the suspension of the constitution to prevent the work of transformation from being disrupted by the voters. You cannot have a democratic central plan because the plan requires unitary direction. If the government tolerates strikes or opposition, the plan collapses. Therefore, the government must suppress unions and strikes to preserve the system. The plan ultimately substitutes police pressure for the choice of the consumer. Finally, we addressed Hayek's chilling observation regarding leadership selection in a planned society. Because the implementation of a central plan often requires forcing people to do things they do not wish to do, such as moving to a new region or accepting lower wages for the greater good, the system selects for leaders who are willing to use coercion without hesitation. In a system where the state controls everything, the men who rise to the top are not the efficient wealth creators, but those with superior political skills in maneuvering the bureaucracy. Often those who are sufficiently unscrupulous to impose the will of the state upon the reluctant population. The system creates a vacuum that only a dictator can fill. Ultimately, the tragedy of planned economies is that they promise liberation but deliver servitude. By stripping the individual of property rights, the state strips them of the material basis of autonomy. As Mises concluded, there is no third way. One must choose between the market economy, where consumers are supreme, or the socialist state, where the government uses compulsion to enforce its will. We have seen the failure of the planned economy in China in the Mao era, yet we all now think of China as a great economic power, indeed, as a prospective political superpower. How did this transformation occur? And what can it tell us about Marxist theory? We begin our examination not with economics but with biology. The fundamental challenge for any living organism, and by extension any society, is the struggle against entropy. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that every closed system moves inexorably from order to disorder. To survive, a living system must be open. It must ingest energy from outside itself to resist this decay. Crucially, it must possess the capacity for adaptation. Survival is not a static state. It is a continuous process of making creative adjustments to an environment that is too complex to be predicted. As the historian Jacob Burckhardt observed, the essence of history is change, and the way to annihilation is prepared by a degeneration that renders the system incapable of effective responses to new situations. We will use a central metaphor for our presentation. The term the birdcage economy was famously coined by Chen Yun, a leading Chinese Communist Party official who sought to moderate the radicalism of Mao Zedong. Chen advocated a hybrid approach. The bird was the market, the cage was the central plan. If you hold the bird too tightly in your hand, you strangle it. If you let it go, it flies away. Therefore, you must keep it inside a cage. The bird is allowed to fly, but only within the rigid parameters set by the state. While this acknowledges that the bird, or the market, has life, it assumes the cage, the plan, is the necessary structure for order. However, as we shall see, when institutions become ends in themselves rather than means for producing energy, they ossify. They create a closed system that cannot adapt to the unforeseen changes that define the real world. How does the bird survive when the cage restricts its movements? It adapts in ways the cage builders never intended. In the centrally planned economies of the 20th century, we observe a fascinating phenomenon. The very survival of the population often depended on their ability to circumvent the official system. In the wake of disasters like the Great Leap Forward, mere survival required entrepreneurial guile, the ability to lie, charm, hide, steal, and manipulate the state. As one survivor noted, those who stole food survived, those who didn't died. Because the state was incapable of managing the allocation of scarce resources effectively, an informal entrepreneurship or black market had emerged. This was not a side effect, it was the life support system. The second economy reduced the scarcity of consumer goods and directed political frustration into economic pursuits. In China, private entrepreneurs found ways to survive by becoming dependent enterprises. They would pay a state unit to use its name and bank account, wearing a red hat to disguise their private activity. They survived by adapting their appearance to fit the bars of the cage. Conversely, Where adaptation is forbidden, we see necrosis. In a market economy, capital and labour are constantly reshuffled. Unexpected changes cause the disintegration of old capital combinations and the formation of new ones. This creative destruction is the motor of progress. In the birdcage, however, the state attempts to freeze these relationships to maintain its stability. But as Lachman argues, capital has no natural measure and its value is affected by every unexpected change. By preventing the liquidation of malinvestment, by keeping the zombie factories alive within the cage, the planned economy prevents the necessary adaptation to reality. The result is a system that creates the illusion of stability while rotting from within. Therefore, survival by adaptations refers to two distinct realities. First, it refers to the ingenuity of the human spirit, which finds ways to trade and create value even under the most oppressive restrictions. The bird finding a way to breathe despite the cage. Secondly, it serves as a warning. Any economic system that inhibits resiliency and prohibits the cutting and filling process of evolutionary change is doomed to collapse. The cage does not protect the bird. Eventually, it starves it. To understand the necessity of the birdcage, that hybrid model where the market is the bird and the plan is the cage, we must first diagnose the ailment of the pure command economy. Why did the architects of a Chinese transition, such as Chen Yun, realize that the bird could not simply be strangled? The diagnosis is not merely that the state was inefficient, but that it suffered from a cognitive and structural blindness. The central planner, no matter how intelligent or well-informed, is afflicted by what Friedrich Hayek termed the scientistic error, the false belief that society can be engineered like a machine. The first part of our diagnosis is the confusion of technical problems with economic problems. Planners view the economy as a physical system of inputs and outputs. They assume that if they can control the quantity of money or the allocation of steel, they can control the outcome. Hayek described this as the fatal conceit, the idea that man is able to shape the world according to his wishes, replacing a spontaneous process with conscious control. However, this involves a mechanical application of thought to a field where it does not belong. As we see in the sources, this approach leads to the belief that full employment or prosperity can be assured simply by maintaining total money expenditure, ignoring the complex qualitative discrepancies between supply and demand in specific sectors. The second and most fatal aspect of a diagnosis is the economic calculation problem. As Ludwig von Mises demonstrated, the fundamental problem with socialism is not a lack of resources, but a lack of calculability. Without private ownership of the means of production, there are no markets for capital goods. Without markets, there are no genuine money prices. And without prices, there is no common denominator to calculate profit and loss. Consequently, the planner cannot determine the most economic use of resources. Mises famously argued that in such a system, the planner is groping in the dark. They may produce detailed maps and charts, the bars of the cage, but they cannot answer the fundamental question: is the value of the output greater than the value of the inputs? Planners can calculate in kind, physical units like tons of steel, but they cannot calculate in value or utility. This leads to the production of goods that are technically functional but economically worthless, creating a system of planned chaos. The third system is the inability to process information. Hayek argued that the knowledge required to run an economy is never given to a single mind in its totality. It exists as dispersed bits of incomplete and contradictory knowledge held by separate individuals. Crucially, much of this knowledge is tacit. It is the knowledge of the man on the spot regarding the particular circumstances of the time and place. This knowledge cannot be conveyed statistically to a central planning board without losing its essence. In a market, the price system functions as a system of telecommunications, allowing individuals to adjust their activities to events of which they have no direct knowledge. The planned economy severs these wires. The diagnosis, therefore, is that the brain of the state is cut off from the sensory data of the economic body. Therefore, the diagnosis is clear. The cage, or the plan, is structurally incapable of rational economic calculation. It suffers from a permanent information deficit that no amount of computing power can resolve because the data required for calculation is generated only by the very market processes the plan suppresses. This necessitated the survival of the bird, the market, not as a luxury, but only as a mechanism capable of keeping the economy alive. Following our diagnosis of the terminal inefficiencies of the planned economy, we arrive at prescription number 1. This introduces the initial remedy applied by the architects of Chinese economic transition, notably Chen Yun. Faced with the catastrophic failures of the Great Leap Forward and the structural inability of the command economy to feed its people, the leadership realized they faced a dilemma. To totally liberate the economy would mean the end of political control, but to hold it too tightly would mean economic death. Chen Yun famously resolved this with a metaphor that defined an era. The bird was the market and the cage was the central plan. This was not a move towards Western free market capitalism, but a survival mechanism. It was an admission that the cage of the state could not generate the necessary energy to sustain life, so the bird of the market was introduced to prevent starvation and economic collapse. How was this metaphor translated into policy? The primary mechanism was the dual-track system. This created a schizophrenic economy where every commodity had two pieces. State-owned enterprises were still required to meet production quotas. For these targets, the state supplied raw materials, timber, steel, cement, at artificially low fixed prices. Crucially, however, once the quota was met, enterprises were allowed to sell any surplus production on the open market. On this second track, the same materials fetched a much higher price, determined by supply and demand rather than bureaucratic degree. This incentivized production beyond the plan. This prescription also altered the relationship between the worker and the state through the contract responsibility system. Previously, the iron rice bowl guaranteed income and employment regardless of effort. The new prescription introduced contracts signed between the state and enterprise managers and between managers and employees. These contracts tied rewards directly to performance. Workers who produced more were paid more. Enterprising work teams were given the leeway to opt out of central planning entirely once their contractual obligations to the state were met, producing goods exclusively for the market. This allowed the bird to thrive in the spaces left by the cage. However, this prescription created a new pathology, massive corruption and arbitrage. Because there were two prices for the same good, immense profits could be made simply by diverting goods from the plan track to the market track. A factory might buy steel at the cheap state price, ostensibly for production, and immediately resell it on the open market for a profit. Paradoxically, the planned economy, which claimed to serve the greater good, spawned a system where personal networks and bribery prevailed. State units collaborated with private businesses to exploit the price system, passing on supplies for free. The only way to navigate this complex cage was through entrepreneurial guile, lying, hiding, and manipulating the state apparatus to secure resources. Therefore, prescription 1 was not a cure, but a stabilizer. It saved the economy from immediate necrosis by allowing the market to breathe, but by confining it within the cage of a plan, it created a distorted, corrupt, and highly volatile hybrid system, a dependent economy where private profit relied on the looting of state assets. We have seen how the dual-track system, or prescription 1, attempted to revive the domestic economy. But the Chinese leadership faced a second, more dangerous dilemma. They desperately needed foreign capital and technology to modernize, yet they feared that opening the door would let in spiritual pollution, the Western concepts of democracy and individual liberty. As Deng Xiaoping famously remarked, "When you open the window, flies and mosquitos come in." Prescription 2, therefore, was the creation of an economic airlock. This slide details the establishment of special economic zones designed to import the vitality of capitalism while quarantining its political consequences. The inspiration for this prescription was Hong Kong, By the late 1970s, Hong Kong had become a powerhouse of finance and manufacturing, serving as the mainland's indispensable link to the world. The leadership realized they could utilize Hong Kong's capital and expertise without adopting its political system. This evolved into the radical concept of one country, two systems. In 1979, the party established special economic zones in sleepy backwaters like Shenzhen, just across the border from Hong Kong. The logic was explicit. The state would provide the land and labour, while foreign investors would provide the capital and technology. Crucially, Premier Zhao Xingyang clarified the limits of this experiment. What we are setting up are special economic zones, not special political zones. We must uphold socialism and resist capitalism. The zones were laboratories where market mechanisms could be tested in isolation, preventing the infection from spreading to the rest of the socialist body politic. Foreign observers often mistook these zones for a transition to free market capitalism. However, as this slide argues, the regime was not adopting capitalism. It was appropriating capitalist tools in socialist hands. Despite the appearance of private enterprise, the Communist Party retained absolute control over the commanding heights of the economy. To this day, the state owns all the land and controls the banking system. Capital remains a political good, distributed by state banks to achieve political goals rather than purely economic returns. When the state began listing companies on stock markets in New York and Hong Kong, it was not privatization in the Western sense, it was corporatization, a method of raising funds from global investors while the state retained majority ownership and the power to appoint the board of directors. As Deng Xiaoping asserted during his famous Southern tour in 1992, foreign investment was safe because political power is in our hands. Ultimately, Prescription 2 created a paradox, a globally integrated economy that remains politically hermetic. The regime built an insulated system capable of fencing off the country, while goods and capital flow out, the movement of information and people into the country is strictly controlled. This allowed the regime to survive the collapse of global communism. By using the special economic zones as an airlock, they successfully imported the economic dynamism required to feed the population and build infrastructure, without importing the bourgeois liberalisation, such as the separation of powers or an independent judiciary, that they viewed as an existential threat. Therefore, Prescription 2 was not a capitulation to the market, but a strategic adaptation. It allowed the bird of foreign capital to enter the cage, fattening the economy, while the bars of the cage, the party's monopoly on power, remained as rigid as ever. We have examined the birdcage of the domestic dual track system, Prescription 1, and the airlock of the special economic zones, Prescription 2. We now arrive at Prescription 3, which addresses how the regime managed the challenge of globalization. By the turn of the millennium, the Chinese leadership faced a critical juncture: how to integrate fully into the global economy, joining the World Trade Organization, without losing the political control inherent in the socialist system. The solution was a strategy known as the Go Out initiative. This prescription did not dismantle the cage, rather it expanded the cage to encompass the global market, allowing the state to subvert the mechanisms of free trade to serve national strategic goals. The first component of this prescription involved a fundamental manipulation of trade mechanics. Standard economic theory dictates an iron law of free trade. The foreign currency a country earns through exports should eventually be spent abroad, balancing the flow. However, the iron hand of the state intervened to break this cycle. Instead of allowing earnings to circulate back into the global economy through consumer spending, the state forced the country to save. It maintained a fixed exchange rate to keep exports artificially cheap and imports expensive. To prevent market traders from bidding up the value of the currency, which would have hurt export competitiveness, the central bank created vast quantities of domestic currency to buy up the incoming dollars. These accumulated dollars were then ploughed into US Treasury bonds. This created a cycle where the state subsidized its own export industries while financing the debt of its customers. effectively locking the global market into a dependency on its manufacturing output. The second component addressed the internal threat posed by the rising class of private entrepreneur. Under Jiang Zemin, the party formulated the theory of the three represents. On the surface, this policy appeared to be a liberalization. It ended the ban on party membership for private business people. Western observers gasped with admiration, believing the party was democratizing. In reality, it was Orwellian doublespeak, designed to extend the hand of the state, not retract it. The policy dictated that party cells be established within private businesses. These cells were not merely social clubs. Their mandate was to unite, educate and guide private entrepreneurs, ensuring they obeyed the law, supported party policies and contributed to the state. This effectively placed a political commissar inside the boardroom of every major private enterprise, ensuring that the bird of the market remained firmly under the supervision of the party. Finally, Prescription 3 entrenched the dominance of state-owned enterprises through the banking system. Despite the rise of the public sector, the state banking system continued to funnel massive credit injections into inefficient state-owned enterprises. When the economy slowed, these companies would go into hibernation. When credit was injected, their dormant debts were reactivated. This created a vicious circle of credit injection, production overstocking, and arrears. The system produced goods for which no market existed, simply to maintain employment and output figures. This activity counted towards gross domestic product, but it represented a structural misallocation of capital that only a state-controlled banking monopoly could sustain. Therefore, Prescription 3 was the consolidation of state capitalism. By manipulating currency markets, co-opting private entrepreneurs into the party structure, and using state banks to support strategic industries, the regime successfully took the birdcage global. It proved that the state could utilize market mechanisms to accumulate power without succumbing to market discipline. We now arrive at Prescription 4, the state advances. If the previous prescriptions were about managing the market to ensure survival, this phase represents a fundamental shift in confidence. The turning point was the global financial crisis of 2008. While the West reeled from the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the Eurozone crisis, the Chinese leadership saw an opportunity. They interpreted the chaos in the capitalist world not merely as a market fluctuation, but as a validation of their authoritarian system. The birdcage was no longer viewed as a transitional necessity. It was hailed as a superior model of civilization. The regime ceased to be defensive and began to aggressively assert the dominance of the state over the private sector. The defining economic doctrine of this prescription is encapsulated in the slogan, "The state advances, the private sector recedes." To avert the global recession, Premier Wen Jiabao launched a massive stimulus package worth $586 billion, equivalent to 14% of the country's economic production. Crucially, this flood of new credits was not distributed evenly by market mechanisms. It was directed by the state-owned banking monopoly primarily towards state-owned enterprises. The banks were directed to lend to large state companies in key industries like steel, coal, and aluminium. Flush with state cash, inefficient state behemoths absorbed smaller, more efficient private rivals. In a series of virtual hostile takeovers, loss-making state competitors swallowed up private airlines and steel mills. The private sector, which had been the engine of job creation, began to wither as the state sector monopolized capital. The goal was no longer efficiency, it was control. This economic retrenchment was accompanied by profound ideological hubris. Following the 2008 crisis, the leadership began to lecture the West. They blamed the blind pursuit of profit for Western failures and championed the China way or the China model. Officials like Central Bank Governor Zhu Xiaochan argued that the rapid response to the crisis demonstrated the superiority of the socialist political system. This evolved into a belief that the 21st century would belong to China, superseding the American model. Domestically, this meant a return to orthodoxy. The regime launched campaigns to uphold the Four Cardinal Principles and the dictatorship of the proletariat, explicitly rejecting Western concepts like the separation of powers or judicial independence. Finally, Prescription 4 relied on the brute force of infrastructure spending to maintain growth targets. The state poured billions into projects regardless of utility. We saw the construction of high-speed rail lines through deserts, massive airports running at a loss, and the duplication of infrastructure by local governments competing for prestige. This growth was fueled entirely by debt. Local governments circumvented borrowing limits by creating thousands of financing vehicles to issue off-balance sheet bonds. Between 2010 and 2020, while growth doubled, total debt trebled to 280% of output. By 2014, the government admitted that trillions had been squandered on ineffective investment. The economy became addicted to credit, requiring ever larger injections of cash to generate diminishing returns. Ultimately, Prescription 4 reveals the true nature of the birdcage. It is not a path to liberty, but a mechanism for state aggrandizement. By starving the private sector to feed the state sector, and by funding growth through unsustainable debt, the regime solidified its political control at the expense of economic vitality. The bird is still alive, but the cage has become a fortress, and the air inside is running out. This brought about the synthesis. For decades, Western economists and politicians operated under the comforting assumption that China's economic reforms were a transition towards Western-style capitalism and eventually democracy. They believed the bird would inevitably outgrow the cage, forcing the bars to break. We argue that this assumption was false. The current system is not a halfway house on the road to a free market. It is a deliberate synthesis of Leninist political control and market mechanisms. The bird has not escaped. The cage has simply been expanded and reinforced to accommodate a larger, stronger bird that now works for the state. If China were truly a market economy, why does the Communist Party still insist on drafting and implementing 5-year plans? As the historian Frank de Cotter observes, what we have witnessed is not the abandonment of the command economy, but merely tinkering with a planned economy. In classic Marxist parlance, a socialist economy is defined by who controls the means of production. By this metric, the synthesis remains fundamentally socialist. To this day, the state retains ownership of all land. It owns the vast majority of raw material resources. It controls major industries directly or indirectly. And crucially, it owns the banks. The birdcage ensures that while private commerce generates wealth, the ultimate allocation of capital and resources remains in the hands of the party. Second, the synthesis resolves the tension between the market and the state by creating a model often termed state capitalism. The state does not need to run the noodle shop or the hair salon. Those are left to the bird of the market. However, the state retains an absolute grip over the commanding heights of the economy: energy, finance, telecommunications, and transport. Contrary to the view that state-owned enterprises are inevitably stagnant, the regime has directed them to innovate in strategic sectors. Research suggests that while government ownership can create inefficiencies, the state actively directs research and development expenditure in these firms to serve national strategic goals rather than purely commercial ones. The state uses the market to test technology, but the technology ultimately serves the state. Finally, we see the ideological synthesis. The hope that economic integration would lead to political liberalization has been dashed. As we saw in previous slides, the 3 represents policy co-opted entrepreneurs into the party, ensuring that the capitalist class became a pillar of the authoritarian regime rather than a force for democracy. The birdcage was not a temporary scaffolding. It is the architecture of the modern Chinese state. The synthesis is a system where the market is permitted to exist only insofar as it strengthens the capacity of the cage. The bird is allowed to fly, but only to fetch resources for the master. In summary, the birdcage economy teaches us that the mechanism of the market can be severed from the philosophy of liberty. By mastering the use of capitalist tools in socialist hands, the regime has created a potent, durable, and authoritarian alternative to the Western model. A system where the bird is well fed, but the cage is stronger than ever. But what are the side effects? We have seen how the birdcage, the synthesis of Leninist political control and market mechanisms, allowed the regime to survive and the economy to grow. However, this hybrid system generates unique and virulent pathologies. These are not merely growing pains, they are structural consequences of a system where the state controls the commanding heights of the economy while suppressing the rule of law. When you force the bird of the market to live within the cage of the party state, the environment inside the cage becomes toxic. We identify 4 primary side effects: endemic corruption, structural waste, human exploitation, and the erosion of trust. The first side effect is the industrial scale corruption inherent in a dual track system. In a free market, resources are allocated by price. In the birdcage, the state retains control over land, capital, and energy. This means that every transaction requires a political blessing. As we saw in the previous slides, local officials became protective of their own fiefdoms, erecting trade barriers and demanding fees for access. Consequently, the distinction between government and businesses vanished. Officials used their power to skim off the top, whether through land sales or by accessing cheap state credit to speculate in real estate. We see a system where the wealth that nominally belonged to the state was slipping into the hands of a few individuals. Corruption is not an anomaly. It is the grease that turns the wheels of the cage. The second side effect is economic waste on a staggering scale, driven by the fetishization of gross domestic product growth over economic utility. Because the state directs capital to boost growth targets rather than to satisfy consumer demand, the country is littered with ineffective investments. By 2014, the government admitted that $6.8 trillion had been squandered on projects ranging from unused steel mills to empty stadiums. This haste creates physical danger. We witness the phenomenon of tofu buildings, structures so poorly constructed that they crumble like bean curd. This grim reality was exposed during the Sichuan earthquake, where thousands of school buildings collapsed due to substandard construction, killing thousands of children. The cage produces what the planner wants, not what the market needs. This results in chronic overcapacity, factories churning out mountains of cement, steel and glass that no one buys, leading to deflationary pressure and a vicious cycle of debt. Thirdly, we must look at the human cost. The economic miracle was built on the backs of a labour force that lacks basic human rights. The household registration system, or hukou, divides the population into hereditary caste systems. Migrant workers who fueled the manufacturing boom are treated as second-class citizens in the cities they built, denied access to healthcare and education. Without independent trade unions or the right to strike, workers are treated as disposable components. We see horrific safety records such as in the hardware capital of Yongkang, where thousands of accidents occur annually, leaving a workforce marked by missing fingers and limbs. Ultimately, the synthesis results in a stark imbalance. The state is rich, the people are poor. The household share of national output is among the lowest of any major economy, as wealth is funneled from the savers to the state-owned enterprises. Finally, the lack of independent oversight leads to a breakdown in social trust and product safety. In the rush to cut costs and meet targets, safety standards are bypassed. This leads to a flood of counterfeits that are not just illegal, but lethal. Fake engine oil, adulterated pharmaceuticals, and exploding batteries. The ultimate tragedy of this environment was the infant milk scandal, where milk was adulterated with industrial chemicals to fake protein levels. This sickened hundreds of thousands of babies. Because local officials shielded the enterprises to protect local tax revenue, the central government covered up the scandal for months. Therefore, the side effects of the birdcage are profound. By removing the self-correcting mechanisms of a free society, a free press, an independent judiciary, and the right to dissent, the regime has created an engine of growth that is simultaneously an engine of destruction. It builds skyscrapers, but they are made of tofu. It generates wealth, but people remain poor. It promises stability, but it is built on a mountain of debt. So now we arrive at our conclusion. Throughout this presentation, we have traced the evolution of the Marxist economic model and the Chinese Communist Party's transition from the ideological retrenchment of the late 1970s to the global superpower of today. For decades, the dominant narrative in the West was one of transition. It was assumed that the introduction of market forces, the bird, would inevitably shatter the cage of the party state, leading inexorably to the rule of law and liberal democracy. The evidence we have reviewed suggests that this assumption was fundamentally flawed. The cage did not break, it expanded. The Communist Party successfully utilized capitalist states to strengthen, rather than dismantle, its monopoly on power. First, we must acknowledge that the hybrid system we see today is not an accidental halfway house, but a deliberate construction. As the historian Frank Dicotta documents, from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, the leadership has consistently rejected Western constitutionalism. In 2011, Wu Bangzhou, chairman of the National People's Congress, categorically rejected the separation of powers and privatization, stating that the party would never waver on the fundamental system of the state. What has emerged is a sophisticated form of state capitalism. The state uses markets to create wealth that can be directed by political officials, creating national champions and maintaining employment. But the ultimate motive is political survival rather than economic efficiency. As Deng Xiaoping famously remarked during his southern tour, the market is safe because political power is in our hands. Secondly, while the birdcage generated immense growth by releasing the suppressed energy of the population, it has now reached a structural impasse. Growth has become increasingly dependent on debt. Between 2010 and 2020, while growth doubled, total debt trebled to 280% of output. The system relies on a vicious circle of credit injection to keep zombie state enterprises afloat and to fund infrastructure projects that often lack economic utility. Because capital is allocated by the state rather than by market price signals, the result is a massive malinvestment. By 2014, the government admitted that trillions have been squandered on ineffective investments, including steel mills and empty stadiums. As Ludwig von Mises warned, without genuine market prices for capital goods, a planner, even one equipped with modern technology, cannot distinguish between value creation and capital destruction. Finally, we return to the central tension of the birdcage metaphor, the conflict between control and life. A market economy functions as a discovery procedure, utilizing the dispersed knowledge of millions of individuals. By insisting on state control over the commanding heights, banking, energy, and communications, the regime suppresses the very price signals required to coordinate a complex economy efficiently. The regime now faces a dilemma. To sustain growth, it needs to boost domestic consumption, which would require a massive redistribution of wealth from the state to the people, a move that would undermine the party's power base. Alternatively, it must continue the credit-fueled expansion of the state sector, which leads to diminishing returns and the threat of financial crisis. Ultimately, the birdcage economy proves that while a state can command industrialization, it cannot command prosperity indefinitely. The easy options, exploiting cheap labor, selling land, and borrowing from the future, are exhausted. The bird has grown too large for the cage, but the keeper refuses to open the door. We are left not with the transition of liberty, which was never promised, but with a powerful though brittle authoritarianism which has successfully co-opted the market mechanism within the iron frame of the state.